Now we're going to get into evaluating nitrogen needs, and this module will be specifically focused on soil testing. Uh, for nitrogen, there's a number of different ways that we can think about evaluating N needs, and those can be broadly classified into either soil testing or plant testing. And plant testing further broken down into visual symptoms, plant analysis, and plant sensing. Nitrogen, we've discussed at this point, it's a very leaky and dynamic nutrient, a very important nutrient. What are the tools that we have available to use, the diagnostics that we have that can inform us on what a crop needs for in terms of nitrogen, right? So that's like this idea of evaluating the nitrogen need of a crop, and this is really what we're getting into. Okay, so it's specifically talking about soil testing. An example soil test. There's a number of different commercial labs out there that provide services, and they have different soil test reports, but it's pretty common when you submit a soil sample, you'll get soil test results back. And if you've never looked at this, we'll be spending more time on this throughout the course of the semester. But there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 soils that are sampled here. The idea, the lab number, and we look at what the actual measurements that are made that are reported. So we have phosphorus, we have organic matter, potassium, magnesium, calcium, sodium. We have soil pH, which we've covered. CEC, again, we've covered. A percent cation saturation. Then we get down into sulfur, zinc, manganese, iron, copper, boron. So our micronutrients down here are secondary nutrient with sulfur. What is missing from the soil test report? This would be considered a quote-unquote basic or very, very common soil test that this particular lab, ENR Great Lakes in Fort Wayne, would offer, which is very consistent with a number of other labs, kind of standard, quote-unquote routine or standard practice. There's a very important nutrient that's missing here, folks, and it's nitrogen, right? Nitrogen is not something that it's typically reported on a soil test, and it's for a number of different reasons. And people, it's very counterintuitive. You're like, how is one of the, you tell me it's the most limiting nutrient in certainly in agricultural systems, but in most terrestrial ecosystems, and how is it that we're not routinely reporting it? Okay, so one of the problems is that this goes on to some of the things that we've been talking about the last week and a half, is that nitrogen is a very challenging nutrient to manage for a number of reasons. So we can think, this is a bit of a busy slide, but we can think of inputs in terms of nitrogen, right? So we've got potentially fertilizer inputs, crop residue, and amendments, and then soil organic matter. So these, for the input category, these are 3 columns that would be going in and forming through the processes of mineralization, forming our plant available nitrogen. So again, ammonium and nitrate as the 2 primary sources of N that plants take up. And then, of course, these are often in high demand in ag systems, so these will be taken up through crop uptake and immobilized into plant tissue, and the roots are translocated to the shoots and the reproductive structures. But there's a really important piece here, and these are the losses, right? And we've talked about volatilization, and that's not on this slide, but really from a loss perspective, we can think of crop uptake as loss, or plant uptake as a loss. It does represent a net loss out of the system, although that will typically be, for profit or be recycled if it's a natural system. But 2 primary losses are denitrification and nitrate leaching. Okay, and so the reality is that there's a number of potential inputs going into this pool and potential outputs going out of that pool, and so a challenge or a conundrum for routine soil testing. And this has really been a bit of a holy grail for a long, long time, for decades, in soil science is trying to come up with a very rapid indicator to measure nitrogen availability to plants over the course of that growing season. And the reality is, here we are in 2019, 2018, 2017, 2000. This is work that was started really in the 70s and the 60s, trying to come up with a good nitrogen indicator. And it's challenging. And we don't have a standardized unit that we use and is used kind of exclusively. So 50 plus years in soil science. One thing that we do know that works reasonably well is what we would classify as incubation methods, okay? And so really one of the kind of main citations is in 1972 for this. And this is taking soils out of the field, putting them in the lab, and then measuring mineralization rates in that soil, okay? So these kind of incubation methods, measuring mineralizable nitrogen in soil in a lab settings, can be accurate, can reasonably reflect what actually happens in the soil, but to do it right, it often takes a long time, and it's meaning that it takes weeks or months long incubation. Other methods have been developed. Of course, we've tried to shave that time off, but it's challenging because we're trying to mimic a biological process in terms of converting organic nitrogen to a plant available nitrogen, and that will take time. So there are methods that are out there. I'm not trying to suggest that there aren't, and we can dive into them, and we'll get into them just a teeny bit in a second. But other methods have been met with limited success and adoption, but it's important. My lab is actively working on this, and we think that there's still value and still potential, but it's kind of a long road. Okay. So part of this challenge of quantifying soil nitrogen pools is thinking about what's actually in the soil. Okay, and so although it's a very common measurement in soil science, maybe not that common in, say, a routine kind of real world perspective or a farmer test, but we can measure total nitrogen. That is, we take soil, we actually combust that soil, we burn that soil at a very high temperature, and it will give us the total amount of nitrogen in that soil sample. But we recognize that soil organic matter is made up of a lot of different fractions, and we can think about inorganic fractions, labile biotic fractions, labile meaning chemically reactive and more associated with biological forms. There's clay fixed nitrogen, and then there's this giant pool of recalcitrant soil nitrogen. Recalcitrant meaning essentially non-reactive, not plant available, okay? And there's different methods that we'll get into this. Inorganic N via KCl extraction, soil ammonium and nitrate, that's typically this KCl extraction. We'll talk about this in just a second. And all the particulars of the slide aren't really important, but if you wanted to do a deeper dive, you can kind of get into this if you like. This labile biotic fraction, examples include a mineralizable nitrogen. So that would be, say, an incubation-based method where you bring that soil into the lab and let it sit for some time under controlled temperature and moisture, and then let that mineralization occur, and you measure the product of that mineralization. There's other methods, things such as an amino sugar nitrogen. So we talked really briefly already about amino sugars being a component of total organic matter, total nitrogen, or that organic fraction of nitrogen. Things like the Illinois side-dress nitrate test, the SLAN test by Solvita, and then the N-STAR. This is a test coming out of the University of Arkansas. And these are all tests that really measure this amino sugar nitrogen. And I'm not going to get into this. We could certainly get into it a little bit later in the course. We might talk more about it with soil health. And these would all be kind of considered soil health indicators, because it's not just kind of the run-of-the-mill ammonium and nitrate that you would find in this inorganic fraction. Protein and respiration are other tests that my lab works with. And so, part of the challenge is which one to target, okay? And some of that deals with the sensitivity piece. And so this isn't real data, it's just a concept. And again, we can go back to the previous slide and look at these different pools and then how they actually will fluctuate over time, okay? And again, the challenge is, can we develop a soil test where we're measuring that soil and being able to predict not just how much mineralization that's going to occur, but maybe how much mineralization is going to occur and then how much little loss will occur, like how much is it going to denitrify, how much is it going to leach out, etc. And we think about an environment like Ohio with the rainfall patterns and it's very challenging to actually do that. So it's unlikely that we're going to have a magic bullet test that that tells all. If it were that easy, it probably would have been done. But we probably have to combine a number of pieces of information together, whether those be multiple tests or multiple tests calibrated with precipitation, et cetera, et cetera. So, anyways, getting back to this slide here, thinking about what's the fluctuation or the availability over time, and something like inorganic N, which is soil nitrate and ammonium. These are actually what that plant sees, but depending on the time of year, we can have really rapid rates of uptake or we can have rapid rates of loss, and that can really influence the total quantity of that pool, right? So how much might be there in the soil versus not can fluctuate within a matter of days. And you can take a number, say like nitrate, that would go from 10 part per million to 5 part per million after one large rainfall event. So it might be potentially challenging to that's not a measurement that's what we would call very ephemeral, and depending on the time point that you take that, it might give you very different answers. Total nitrogen is related to total organic matter, right? We saw that already. And this is a giant pool that does change with management, but it changes very slowly over the course of years and sometimes decades. And so, there's very little fluctuation that might occur over the course of a growing season, or the course of several seasons. So in some sense, we don't want a measurement that's very ephemeral, and we don't want a measurement that's really stagnant. We want something that's going to be relatively sensitive to management, but have some kind of fluctuation, some kind of ability to track changes and be reflective of total soil nitrogen status. And so here, this labile organic N fraction defined as some of these tests is a promise. Conceptually, it's promising and it's attractive to kind of look at and think about these as potential indicators for available nitrogen. Okay, and there's people that are doing just that thing. And the whole world of soil health, it's kind of a brave new world, and so we'll talk certainly more about that as the semester goes on, but for the purposes right now, I'm just going to talk to you about, just going to spend a couple slides talking about some of the tried and true or more traditional methods out there, okay, things that have been vetted for quite a while. So because soil anisodynamics, soil tests are not commonly offered or performed, depending on the state or crop, organic matter often roughly informs available soil nitrogen, but some universities might use it, some universities might not. So the most typical soil N test that is used is this pre-side dress nitrate test. It's typically done, often done before, say, for a corn crop as a nitrogen demanding crop, but it can be done in the early growth stages. And what the test will actually do is measure a total nitrate soil. It's not nitrate and ammonium, but it's actually just nitrate as the larger fraction, right? And so nitrate versus relative corn yield. Again, when nitrate hits a certain level, and adding more nitrogen via nitrate is not going to get you any greater yields, but if you say reduce to a certain kind of critical level, then we can see yield reductions. That's what these two graphs are actually, all three graphs are really showing. So, and we can see that there's a lot of spread in the data, and there's not particularly a perfect cutoff point, right? So here we've got lines drawn, but where do you actually draw this line? Well, we've got statistical tools that can help us do that, but typically something around 25 part per million nitrate to 30 part per million nitrate would be that cutoff level when they would say, university recommendations would say, you don't need any more nitrogen fertilizer after that point. But it's very common that you're going to find soils that don't have that much nitrogen. Maybe that's 10 or 15. Or, the question is, can we back off some of our nitrogen if we're at 20 versus if we're at 10? So these are things that, again, are based on a state-by-state level. Ohio historically has not used this test very much, and we can talk about some of the reasons why that is, but it's just not been something, a major focus in terms of the recommendation. So we'll see if that holds true moving forward, but the last, say, 20, 30 years has not been something that's been widely promoted in Ohio itself. You go to places like Wisconsin, places like New York that are very forage-based, a lot of kind of dairy and fields coming out of, say, like alfalfa or clovers going into corn, then we see more promotion and more use of this test. Okay. So the tests, I'm using this inorganic N kind of synonymously with the addition of nitrate and ammonia. So it's the sum of nitrate and ammonia. Sometimes people call it plant available N. It is our most common soil test. The steps here, it's relatively simple conceptually. We take a 2 molar KCl. The potassium, that's potassium chloride, so the potassium has a plus charge, the chloride has a minus charge. That you shake that in soil for typically 30 minutes, sometimes up to 60, depending on the protocol. The anion and the anion of chloride and the cation of potassium displace the nitrate and ammonium out of the soil. We filter that, and then we run that to measure the concentration. So that's a colorimetric reaction, typically measured on a flow analyzer or measured spectrophotomically. So that's just the method in a brief, and you can look up protocols for that. But it's just good to know how that's measured. And I'll leave you with a kind of giant gross table that is just summarizing this. This is a recent paper that we published talking about some of the available soil N tests that are out there. And in this paper, we're introducing a soil protein, okay? And that is another test. We talked about these amino sugars. Soil protein is a different pool that we're targeting, but again, it's in this organic labile pool, okay? And so we can think about the various things that are out there. These are the methods. Total soil nitrogen, we talked about that. We could use organic matter that's commonly measured in labs via loss on ignition as a proxy for total nitrogen. Here's nitrate and ammonium. Here's these incubation methods. And then there's different characteristics. So this is just kind of some of the important things that we talked about in the context of the advantages or disadvantages for making these a test that are these really tests that can be implemented commercially? Can they be high throughput in a commercial testing lab? Can they be inexpensive? Are they responsive to management changes? Functionally, what do they reflect in the soil? And then what's their overall potential as a soil health indicator? Okay, so here's the reference if you're interested in kind of digging a little bit deeper into this. I'm not going to spend really a lot of time on this, and you're not responsible for memorizing all this, but it's just kind of good to know. And it kind of feeds into this idea that nitrogen is a challenging nutrient to manage, and we really don't have great, really calibrated soil tests that we can just go out, sample soil, and say, okay, based on this value of this indicator, this measurement, you need to apply, X pounds of N for this crop. I mean, in an ideal world, we would be there, but we're just not there yet. So there's still quite a bit of research that we need in terms of that.